Let me just start by telling you who the Anticancer Fund is, because I appreciate we're not a household name. It's a very small European cancer research trust, and our focus is on non-commercial cancer therapies. And the area I work in is drug repurposing, but there are other areas of cancer therapy that don't get commercial funding. And specifically, I work on a project called the Repurposing Drugs and Oncology Project, which is looking at non-cancer drugs that can be repurposed to be used in cancer, not to address symptoms, but actually to help in the cancer treatment itself. So the problem that we were looking at in this work is to do with generic drugs. So I'm sorry, that probably looks a bit small up there. Off-label usage for repurposed medicines is fine, and we heard an excellent example this morning of how the AKU is being treated with nitisinone. But actually, longer term and for non-rare conditions, it's not ideal. It depends on a doctor's willingness to prescribe off-label, and some doctors are quite risk-averse and are not willing to prescribe off-label. If drugs are used off-label, there's no central recording of outcomes, which means not only do we not learn from things that work, we also don't learn what doesn't work, which is just as important. And increasingly, what we're finding in some of the drugs that we're looking at is that the drugs are disappearing from the market. So there are old drugs, generic drugs, which are no longer used because there are smarter, newer drugs for their original indications. So in the US, for example, there is an antiparasitic treatment called mebendazole, which is available over the counter in the UK, that's being trialled for brain tumours. It's no longer available in the US because newer drugs treat that condition. So generally speaking, we would say that on-label use is the ideal situation. If it's on-label, it means that when the label is granted, clinical guidelines are updated. The health system will go through NICE, and reimbursement will be sorted out. Prescribing systems will be put into place. So these are the things that we're really looking for when we want these drugs to be on label. We're not interested in the finance or commercialization. It's those things. Now, when we've got evidence that these generic drugs are effective, we want to be able to take them through to licensing. But the licensing system means that only a person or a company who's got marketing authorization can do that. So that means only a manufacturer can ask for a drug to have its license changed. So if a patient group or an academic group comes up with fantastic evidence that a drug is effective for a new disease, they cannot by themselves get the drug relabeled. Now, a couple of years ago in the UK, there were some attempts to change the law so that we could change this, so that patient groups or clinicians or whoever could ask for a drug to be updated without having to go through a marketing authorization holder. And unfortunately, for various reasons, that didn't happen. The government didn't support it. But what came out of that, due to the immense public support from patients and from doctors, was the Association of Medical Research Charities and the Department of Health instituted this drug repurposing roundtable to look specifically at the issues around getting repurposed drugs into the NHS. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. The roundtable brought together a huge number of cancer charities, patient groups from different medical areas, people from different parts of the health system, the MHRA, NHS England, NICE, Department of Health. And there were a series of meetings to try and come up with some proposals to address this problem. Now, in some ways, it's a great problem to have, because what we want is for lots of disease areas to have these drugs to kind of go into the system. So it's us getting ahead of the curve, because we expect that this is a problem that we're going to be hitting soon with so many clinical trials of repurposed drugs. As part of that process, 2 examples were taken to the regulator, to the MHRA, to seek scientific advice. And we heard this morning in the AKU case that first clinical trial with 40 patients, the endpoint was not enough to convince the regulators to license. Now, if they had designed that clinical trial effectively the first time round and spoken to the regulators first, that drug would have been licensed and in use a long time ago, and a lot of patients would have benefited. So for us, at the Anticancer Fund, we took a drug called propranolol, which treats high blood pressure, to treat a rare soft tissue sarcoma called angiosarcoma. Breast cancer now took zoledronic acid, which is used to treat osteoporosis, to look at that as a treatment for reducing breast cancer recurrence. It was a really interesting experience, and we learned a lot, but it also meant that we could see by the questions that we were asked by the MHRA how drug companies think about these things. And much as you know, there are problems with pharma, they are very good at getting their stuff through the system and into the clinic. So for repurposing organizations, for patient organizations, we've got a lot to learn to be able to do the same thing. It's not, you know, our focus is usually on what, you know, patient concerns or on answering academic questions, but the regulator, they've got a completely different set of concerns, and if you don't address those in your clinical trials, even a really positive trial can lead nowhere. So some of the outcomes that have come from this process, one immediate one is the British National Formulary, which is the Bible for doctors when it comes to prescribing, will now include off-label uses for drugs. So GPs will be able to look up off-label uses where there is sufficient evidence for a particular off-label use, but they will be able to see information on that off-label use, what what dose to use, what schedule to use. So that's a good thing. It's a recognition that this thing is going on. We produced a framework for drug repurposing into the NHS. So this is a pathway that's designed to take drugs through the process that ends with the drug being used clinically every day, which is where we want to be. Given the financial issues, we came up with a proposal for how we can address some of the specific problems we have with generics. And I'll talk about those in a second. And then a key thing is, you know, one of the things that I learned in this process was that nobody understands how the NHS works. It's the most hugely complex organisation in the world, in my opinion. And even people in the NHS don't really understand how it all fits together. So a key part of this was to have all of these different stakeholders from the NHS in the same room and to try and work out how we could do this, because at the moment it seems very haphazard. And there are these new regional medicines optimization committees which are designed to be able to get drugs in, get the reimbursement sorted out, and get them into use in different areas in the NHS. And that's the pathway that we want to use. Now, the financial incentives issue is this. If you've got a generic drug with multiple manufacturers, there is intense competition and nobody will invest in relicensing a drug. Relicensing a drug costs money. If you relicense it, you've got to go through a whole process. You've got to do pharmacovigilance. There's a whole set of things that you have to do. No generics manufacturer is incentivized to do that, because if they do, somebody else down the road will knock a penny off the pack and get the benefit. So we've got a specific problem. Now, if there's only one manufacturer, it's not a problem. If the drug is not generic yet, it's not a problem. But for this, and for some of the drugs that we're looking at, like propranolol or aspirin or metformin, this is a real problem. Now, for a pharma company developing new molecules, new drugs, they can claim R&D tax credits. So the money that they invest in developing the drugs, they can save on tax. A generics manufacturer, even if they're doing this kind of thing in repurposing, cannot claim R&D tax credits, which is, you know, grossly unfair, and it doesn't incentivize them to do any work. So the proposal we've come up with, in return for not raising the price to the NHS, a manufacturer would work with patient organisations and academics, and then claim their costs as an R&D tax credit, which is a win-win situation, because patients win, the NHS wins because the price is guaranteed, it's not going to go up. So this is a fantastic proposal, in my opinion. It's very, very strongly supported by the British Generics Manufacturers Association, who've been really, really good in working on this. And what we need is for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, for the tax system, to amend these tax rules so that we can bring this into play. It doesn't cover all of the financial issues, so we're not expecting them to pay for the clinical trials or the basic science. That's where people like us and people like you come into this. But if we can solve that final step, it gives us more chance to get these things into practice. So next step, we are continuing to work on this. There are some test cases that we want to put through the RMOX process. And we're also working on building a drugs pipeline, because we need to convince the policymakers and people in the NHS that this is not a hypothetical question. So we are developing a drugs pipeline in the same way that a drugs company was to say, right, in these different disease areas, these are the drugs that are on the horizon. And if there's anyone in this room who's working on that and who's got a drug which they expect to be arriving soon at the end stage, then they should contact us so that we can include it in our discussions with the Department of Health. And in my own area, doing this, we found 190 late phase, this is phase 3 trials in oncology using 72 repurposed drugs. So, if we were a drugs company, this would be a really, really positive drugs pipeline. That's it. Thank you.